Did you know that despite being direct heirs to the English throne, three sisters were systematically written out of history? Imagine a world where powerful women shaped a dynasty, only to vanish from the records. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. And in this video, get ready to discover the forgotten stories of the Seymour Girls, erased Tudor heiresses whose influence was far greater than you've ever been told. When most people recall the Tudor dynasty, they think of Henry VIII, his wives, and his powerful courtiers. Yet behind the familiar tales lies a quieter mystery: the disappearance of women who once stood near the heart of power. Among them were the Seymour sisters, Margaret and Jane, daughters of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, and their cousin Mary Seymour, child of Queen Catherine Parr and Thomas Seymour. Once central to England's ruling circle through Queen Jane Seymour, their family briefly rose to great influence before the women's lives and legacies were almost erased by politics, scandal, and silence. The family's rise began with Jane Seymour, the gentle and devout third wife of Henry VIII. Her marriage to the king in 1536 brought sudden prosperity to her brothers Edward and Thomas. Edward Seymour, a soldier of steady ambition, became the Duke of Somerset and Lord Protector during the minority of his nephew, the young King Edward VI. His brother Thomas, who married Catherine Parr after Henry's death, served as Lord Admiral. The Seymours seemed poised to form the next great dynasty of England. But the family's ascent was built on unstable ground. Edward's authority as protector made him many enemies, and his brother's reckless ambition led him into open conflict with the crown. In 1549, Thomas Seymour was executed for treason, accused of plotting against his own brother and attempting to control the young king. 3 years later, Edward himself was sent to the Tower and met the same fate. These violent ends destroyed the family's standing and left behind a legacy of suspicion. Those who bore the Seymour name carried both privilege and peril. Edward Seymour's daughters, Margaret and Jane, grew up in the midst of this turbulence. Their mother, Stanhope, Duchess of Somerset, was known for her pride and strength of character. Contemporary observers described her as proud, ambitious, and outspoken, qualities that won her few friends among the men who dominated court politics. She raised her daughters to be well-educated and to value intellect and art, in keeping with the humanist ideals of the period. The Seymour sisters were exceptional in their learning. They were fluent in Latin and Greek, skilled in music, and accomplished writers. Their education was comparable to that of the most brilliant women of their time, such as the daughters of Sir Thomas More or Margaret Roper, who had been celebrated a generation earlier. Yet while those women were praised for their piety and learning, the Seymour sisters have been largely forgotten. During the reign of Edward VI, the sisters enjoyed the advantages that came from their father's power. They were raised in comfort and received a refined education, supported by tutors who encouraged their literary interests. But their world changed abruptly after their father's downfall. When the Duke of Somerset was arrested and executed, his titles and estates were confiscated, his family disgraced, and his widow imprisoned. The sisters' privileged upbringing gave way to uncertainty. The court that had once welcomed them now looked at them with suspicion. Yet even in these difficult years, they continued to write, producing a remarkable work of Latin verse that has survived to this day. In 1550, Margaret and Jane collaborated on a poetic tribute to Margaret of Valois, Queen of Navarre. Written in Latin distiches, it mourned the death of the French queen, a noted patron of the arts and early supporter of Protestant reform. This slim volume is one of the earliest known examples of English women publishing original poetry. It demonstrates not only their mastery of classical language, but also their intellectual confidence and shared devotion to humanist ideals. Their choice of subject, honoring a woman known for her learning and independence, was also deeply symbolic. In celebrating Margaret of Navarre, the Seymour sisters were asserting their own right to be heard in a male-dominated world of letters. Yet despite the sophistication of their work, they would soon fade from view. Their poems attracted little attention at the time, and even later historians, drawn to the dramatic lives of queens and statesmen, gave them scant notice. Only modern scholars, re-examining the neglected corners of Tudor literature, have restored their voices to history. Each sister followed a different path, though their stories intersect in the shared experience of being overshadowed. And Seymour, the eldest, married John Dudley's son, Ambrose, who later became the Earl of Warwick. Through this union, she was connected to another family marked by ambition and downfall, for the Dudleys would rise and fall as spectacularly as the Seymours. and served at court under several monarchs, and was known for her intellect and patronage of writers. She composed her own poetry and participated in the cultural life of the Elizabethan court, yet her work was seldom acknowledged in her lifetime. In a world that prized women's virtue and silence, her assertive intelligence was more likely to draw censure than praise. Margaret Seymour, the middle sister, is the most obscure of the three. She shared in her sister's literary accomplishments and was praised by her contemporaries for her learning. Yet she never married and left few records. It is possible that her family's disgrace limited her prospects, or that she preferred a quieter life devoted to study and religion. The fragmentary evidence suggests that she remained close to her sisters and continued writing, but little of her work has survived. Her disappearance from history is a stark example of how easily women's lives could vanish from official memory when they left no male heirs and held no estates. Jane Seymour, the youngest sister, married Sir John Seymour, a distant cousin. She lived through the reigns of Mary and Elizabeth and died in comparative obscurity. Like her sisters, she had been highly educated and was remembered as a woman of virtue and culture, yet almost nothing of her writing or personal life has endured. The three sisters, once celebrated for their learning, were gradually reduced to footnotes in the genealogies of greater men. Their erasure cannot be separated from the political dangers surrounding their family name. After the deaths of Edward and Thomas Seymour, the remaining Seymours had to tread carefully to preserve their safety. The memory of their father's execution and their uncle's treason lingered. For women especially, survival often meant silence. The sisters' writings, steeped in classical learning and moral reflection, may have seemed harmless, but any display of intellect could invite suspicion in an age when women were expected to be modest and deferential. Their Latin poetry, while admired in private circles, did not fit comfortably into the narratives that later chroniclers chose to tell about the Tudor court. Historians favored the dramatic stories of kings and political intrigue, not the quiet persistence of learned women who lived in the margins of power. Over time, the sisters' contributions were eclipsed, their manuscripts lost or misattributed, and their memory confined to the occasional mention in family histories. The disappearance of their cousin, Mary Seymour, is an even deeper mystery, one that captures the vulnerability of women's lives in Tudor England. Mary was born in August 1548 at Sudeley Castle, the only child of Queen Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's last wife, and Thomas Seymour. Her mother was a queen, her father the brother of the most powerful man in the kingdom, and her uncle was the Lord Protector. Few children could claim such illustrious connections. Yet within 2 years she was gone from history. Catherine Parr died shortly after Mary's birth, likely from complications of childbirth. Thomas Seymour's reckless ambition brought him to the block less than a year later. Their infant daughter was left an orphan, stripped of both parents and of the wealth that might have secured her future. For a brief moment, the government made arrangements for her care. Parliament restored some of her father's property, and the Duchess of Suffolk, a friend of Catherine Parr, took her into her household. Then, abruptly, the records fall silent. No letters mention her, no accounts record her maintenance, and no burial entry marks her death. After 1550, Mary Seymour ceases to exist in the written record. Historians have puzzled over this silence for centuries. The most plausible explanation is that she died in infancy or early childhood, perhaps of illness or neglect, and that her death went unrecorded or the record was lost. Yet the lack of any trace is strange, for the daughter of a queen would normally receive some notice, even in death. The total absence of documentation has led some to wonder whether her erasure was deliberate. If Mary had lived, she would have been a living reminder of her father's disgrace. Thomas Seymour had been executed for treason, accused of plotting to marry Princess Elizabeth and of attempting to control the young king. His reputation was blackened, and those who remained loyal to him risked ruin. In such an atmosphere, it may have been safer for all involved if his orphaned child quietly disappeared from public consciousness. To keep her hidden or to let her die unremarked would have spared her guardians from suspicion and the government from awkward questions about her inheritance. It is impossible to know whether anyone consciously sought to erase her, but the result is the same. She was written out of history. For centuries, antiquarians searched parish registers and family papers for a clue to her fate, but none has been found. She remains one of the most haunting figures of the Tudor age, a child born to power and privilege, erased almost at the moment of her birth. The parallel between Mary Seymour's disappearance and the gradual fading of her cousins suggests a broader pattern. The women of the Seymour family were casualties not only of political turmoil, but also of a culture that valued women chiefly as symbols of dynastic alliance. When they could no longer serve that function, they slipped into obscurity. Anne, Margaret, and Jane were remembered briefly for their learning, but their accomplishments were overshadowed by the violent ambitions of their male relatives. Mary, an infant with no political use and a dangerous family name, was allowed to vanish altogether. Their collective silence exposes the limits of Tudor memory. Official histories, shaped by men who chronicled the deeds of rulers and warriors, had little interest in preserving the experiences of women who did not fit those roles. Even so, the traces that remain tell us much about their world. The sisters' Latin verses reveal an engagement with ideas that were rare among English women of their time. They saw themselves as heirs to the humanist tradition, capable of moral reflection and artistic expression equal to that of men. Their education was both a privilege and a danger, for learned women were often mocked or accused of arrogance. Their writings suggest a consciousness of that risk. In Hecata Disticon, they praise the virtues of modesty and wisdom while subtly asserting their own intellectual authority. It is a balancing act that many educated women of the 16th century had to perform. To speak without seeming to challenge the expectations of silence. That their voices were later forgotten is not an accident, but a symptom of how history is made. The chroniclers of the Tudor age, from Edward Hall to Raphael Holinshed, focused on the succession of kings, wars, and political revolts. Women appeared mainly as queens, consorts, or victims. Those who wrote poetry, studied Latin, or maintained private households rarely found a place in such narratives. The survival of manuscripts also played a role. Many family papers were destroyed or scattered during the upheavals of the 17th century, and works written by women were often left unpublished or misattributed. By the time later historians looked back, the evidence of the Seymour sisters' lives had been eroded by time. Yet the mystery of their disappearance continues to draw attention because it reveals the fragility of historical memory. The Seymours were once at the heart of the English court, bound by blood to kings and queens, yet within a generation their women had been reduced to shadows. Their story raises uncomfortable questions about whose lives are preserved and whose are forgotten. Was their erasure simply the product of lost documents and indifferent chroniclers, or did it reflect a deliberate choice to narrow the story of Tudor England to its male protagonists? The answer may lie somewhere between accident and design. Women who wrote in Latin and dared to publish were anomalies in their time. Their work did not fit the image of the dutiful noblewoman that later writers preferred. To remember them would have meant acknowledging that women, too, shaped the intellectual life of the age. In recent decades, scholars have begun to recover fragments of their legacy. The Latin poems of the Seymour sisters have been translated and studied as early examples of female authorship in Renaissance England. Their verses, once obscure, now appear in anthologies of women's writing. Historians have traced their family connections and reconstructed their lives from scattered references. Mary Seymour, too, has reemerged as a subject of fascination. Her brief life has inspired novels, plays, and speculative histories that imagine what might have become of her had she lived. In this renewed attention lies a quiet act of restoration, the undoing, at least in part, of the silence that once surrounded them. Still, the fact that so little is known about them reminds us how many voices remain lost. The Tudor period, for all its splendor, was a time of violent change that left countless lives undocumented. The Seymours' disappearance is both exceptional and typical. Exceptional because of their closeness to power, typical because it shows how quickly even privilege could dissolve when the winds of fortune turned. Their vanishing act is not merely a curiosity, but a window into how history itself is constructed. Power decides what is remembered. The women of the Seymour family stood too close to that power to be entirely ignored, yet too far from it to be preserved. They were caught in the space between prominence and invisibility. The mystery of the Seymour sisters and their cousin Mary endures because it touches something universal in the study of the past. Every historian knows that archives are full of absences. Behind the grand events and famous names are countless others whose stories were never told. The silence surrounding the Seymours is louder because they should have been remembered. They were born into privilege, educated beyond the norm, related to a queen and a king, yet history allowed them to vanish. Their erasure forces us to confront the biases of the record itself. It reminds us that history is not only what survives, but what was chosen to survive. The question of why they were erased has no single answer. Politics, gender, and chance all played their part. The disgrace of their male relatives made their names inconvenient. The limits placed on women's speech made their writings vulnerable to neglect. The accidents of survival destroyed the evidence that might have told their full story. What remains is a faint outline, enough to glimpse their intelligence, their artistry, and their misfortune. The vanishing act of the Seymour sisters and their lost cousin Mary is not a solved mystery, but a continuing challenge. To look beyond the official chronicles and to imagine the lives that slipped through their pages. Jane Seymour's death in the autumn of 1537 marked not only the end of a queen's brief reign, but also the beginning of an uncertain chapter for her family. Her passing, which left King Henry with his long-desired son, but cost him his only wife he claimed to have truly loved, transformed the fate of every Seymour who had risen with her. The family's fortunes, once rising on the gentle charm of the new queen, became tied to the unstable favor of a mercurial monarch. In the eyes of Henry's court, the Seymours had fulfilled their purpose. They had given him a male heir. Without Jane to temper the king's wrath or shield her brothers from his suspicion, the family's place in power became precarious. The men who had gathered influence around her, Edward Seymour, her ambitious eldest brother, and his younger sibling, Thomas Seymour, would spend the next decade walking a narrow path between greatness and ruin. Edward Seymour, already established as a skilled soldier and courtier, had risen quickly after Jane's marriage to the king. Her brief tenure on the throne transformed him from a capable nobleman into one of the most powerful figures in England. By the time of Henry's death in 1547, Edward's position as uncle to the new boy King Edward VI made him indispensable. Appointed Lord Protector, he effectively ruled England in the young monarch's name. His authority, however, provoked jealousy and distrust. His policies, though often guided by reformist principles, alienated both conservatives and fellow reformers. The man once elevated by family loyalty became isolated by it, while his younger brother Thomas, restless and resentful, plotted his own ascent. Thomas Seymour's marriage to the Dowager Queen Catherine Parr, the sixth and last wife of Henry VIII, brought him both prestige and peril. The match, made within months of the old king's death, shocked many at court. To marry the late king's widow without royal consent was daring, even reckless, but Thomas saw opportunity where others saw scandal. Catherine, widowed yet still wealthy, offered him access to power, influence, and proximity to the royal children. Within their household lived Princess Elizabeth, the teenage daughter of Anne Boleyn, whose future was already a matter of speculation. Thomas's flirtations with the young princess, recorded later in uneasy detail, would contribute to his downfall. But in the beginning, his union with Catherine seemed to promise renewal for a family still basking in the reflected glory of Jane Seymour's legacy. That promise was short-lived. In the late summer of 1548, Catherine Parr gave birth to a daughter at Sudeley Castle. The child, named Mary Seymour, carried an extraordinary inheritance. She was the daughter of a queen and the niece of a king. By birth she belonged to the highest circle of England's nobility. Yet even before she could walk, her future began to unravel. Catherine died less than 2 weeks after her child's birth, leaving Thomas Seymour a widower with an infant daughter. His political ambitions, unchecked by his wife's counsel, drove him to reckless extremes. Within months he was accused of treason, imprisoned in the Tower, and executed in the spring of 1549. In the span of a single year, Mary Seymour lost both her parents. What followed was one of the most perplexing vanishings in Tudor history. Parliament restored some of her father's lands and arranged for her care under the guardianship of Catherine Willoughby, Duchess of Suffolk, a friend of her late mother. There are brief records confirming this arrangement, but after about 2 years of age, Mary disappears from all known documents. No burial record survives, no mention of her name appears in letters or court papers, and no claim was ever made in her right to the estates she had inherited. For the daughter of a queen, such silence is extraordinary. Even the children of minor courtiers often left traces in parish registers or family accounts, but Mary's existence seems to have been deliberately forgotten. The most likely explanation is that she died in infancy, perhaps of illness or neglect, her passing unrecorded or lost with the papers of her guardian's household. Yet the complete absence of any notice of her death has led to enduring speculation. Some later writers imagine that she survived under another name or was sent abroad, but no credible evidence supports those theories. It is more likely that her brief life ended quietly and that her guardians, facing political uncertainty and limited resources, did not draw attention to her fate. Her disappearance, however, fits within a larger pattern that shaped the lives of the women of the Seymour family, the gradual erasure of their presence from the narrative of Tudor England. The same forces that destroyed the ambitions of her father and uncle also cast long shadows over her female relatives. Edward Seymour, though he retained power as protector during Edward VI's early reign, faced growing opposition. By 1551, he too was accused of treason and executed. His fall left his wife and Stanhope, Duchess of Somerset, and their children in disgrace. The family's fortunes, once tied to the Queen who had given England its male heir, were again reduced to uncertainty. Yet in the midst of their decline, the Seymour daughters, and Margaret and Jane, quietly cultivated lives of learning and creativity that defied the expectations placed upon them. Raised in the humanist tradition that had shaped Catherine Parr herself, the Seymour sisters were among the most educated women of their generation. Their mother, despite her reputation for pride and ambition, valued intellect and encouraged her daughters to pursue the classical studies usually reserved for men. The girls learned Latin, Greek, and French. They read the scriptures and the works of ancient poets. They were not only literate but articulate, able to engage with ideas that shaped the reforming spirit of their time. Yet in the patriarchal structure of Tudor society, their intelligence was both an asset and a liability. Learned women were admired in theory, but often regarded with suspicion in practice. The sisters' education found its expression in a remarkable collaboration. In the year 1550, the three of them composed a Latin elegy in honor of Margaret of Navarre, the French queen and renowned patron of the arts. The work, titled Hecatodisticon, consisted of 100 distichs mourning the death of a woman they saw as a model of virtue, intellect, and independence. Written in the language of scholars, it demonstrated their mastery of classical form and their participation in the intellectual life of Europe. It also offered a subtle reflection on their own situation. Women born into power, yet constrained by it, aware of the fragility of fortune and the fickleness of fame. For a brief moment, the Seymour sisters' verses shone as evidence that noble women could contribute meaningfully to literature and philosophy. Yet the very qualities that made their work extraordinary ensured that it would be forgotten. In the generations that followed, their names were overshadowed by those of men, fathers, husbands, and brothers who commanded armies or governed states. Women's writings, particularly those in Latin, were rarely preserved unless they served a political or religious purpose. The Seymours' poems, printed in limited copies and circulated among scholars, faded from view. Only centuries later would their authorship be rediscovered by historians of early modern literature. And Seymour, the eldest, married Ambrose Dudley, son of the Duke of Northumberland, whose family rose and fell with the turbulent politics of the mid-16th century. She became Countess of Warwick and spent much of her life at court, navigating the delicate balance between favor and suspicion under successive monarchs. Anne's own poetry, though less widely known than her youthful collaboration, reveals a woman of insight and conviction. She moved in the same circles as other learned women of the Elizabethan court, but never achieved lasting recognition. Her intelligence, though admired by some, made her a target for gossip in a world where ambition in a woman could easily be misread as arrogance. Margaret Seymour, the middle sister, never married. The reasons are unknown, though her family's fall from grace may have limited her prospects. She devoted herself to study and remained close to her mother and sisters. Her voice, like that of many unmarried women of her time, is almost entirely absent from the record. That silence, whether the result of lost papers or deliberate omission, is emblematic of the way history treated women who lived outside the structures of marriage and motherhood. To the chroniclers of Tudor England, such women existed only in relation to the men around them. Once those men were disgraced or dead, their female relatives faded from view. Jane Seymour, the youngest sister, married a distant cousin of the same name, a match that reconnected her to the wider Seymour lineage but brought little distinction. She lived through the reigns of Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, dying sometime in the latter's rule. Like her sisters, she was known for her education and virtue, yet her life left few traces beyond family genealogies. In the great chronicles of the Tudor age, where the deeds of kings and courtiers fill the pages, there is barely a whisper of her existence. The gradual disappearance of the Seymour sisters from public memory was not simply an accident of lost documents. It reflected a deeper cultural process, the narrowing of history's gaze to favor men's deeds and women's misfortunes. The Tudor world was one of spectacle and survival. Those who did not play visible roles at court were easily forgotten, and women who sought recognition outside the prescribed roles of wife and mother faced obstacles that ensured their obscurity. The Seymours, once a symbol of dynastic triumph, became a cautionary tale of how swiftly favor could turn to disgrace. Their male relatives' ambition had lifted them to the heights of power and dragged them down again. Their own quiet achievements, rooted in learning rather than politics, found no place in the narratives written by male historians of their age. Mary Seymour's fate, whether death in infancy or erasure by design, serves as a poignant reflection of that process. Her life began as a promise of continuity for the queen whose marriage had united the crown and the Seymour family. Yet within 2 years of her birth, she was gone, leaving behind not even a grave. The same shadow of forgetting extended over her cousins, whose intellectual lives were too private, too female, to capture the attention of chroniclers obsessed with wars, marriages, and executions. The vanishing act of the Seymour women, as later historians have called it, was not a single event, but a gradual effacement that unfolded across decades. In that sense, their story is less a mystery than a mirror of the times. Tudor England was a world where power and memory were inseparable. To be remembered, one had to be useful to those who wrote history, to reinforce dynastic legitimacy, to embody virtue or vice, to serve as a moral example. The Seymour women, deprived of their political standing by the deaths and executions of their fathers and husbands, could no longer serve those purposes. Their silence suited a society eager to move on from the scandals that had surrounded their name. Even their learning, remarkable as it was, could not rescue them from obscurity in a culture that prized female modesty over expression. Yet their disappearance also challenges the way we understand the Tudor story. For every figure like in Boleyn or Elizabeth Tudor, whose lives were preserved in letters, chronicles, and portraits, there were countless others whose experiences remain hidden. The Seymours occupy a space between fame and oblivion, close enough to the center of power to glimpse its brilliance, yet not permitted to share in its light. The survival of their Latin poems, fragile and overlooked, is a rare glimpse into what might have been a vibrant female intellectual culture within the English nobility. That their words endured at all, across centuries of neglect, is a quiet defiance of the forces that sought to silence them. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, the Seymour name had regained some measure of respectability through distant relatives and descendants, but the memory of the sisters themselves had already faded. Their writings lay forgotten in scholarly libraries, their portraits unpainted, their graves unvisited. Mary Seymour's name survived only as a footnote in the lives of her more famous parents. The women who had once stood near the heart of the Tudor court became ghosts of history, their lives recorded not in the annals of power, but in the silences between its lines. Their vanishing is more than a curiosity. It is a reminder of how fragile remembrance can be. History is not an impartial mirror, but a constructed narrative, shaped by the priorities and prejudices of its tellers. The disappearance of the Seymour women exposes the cost of that selectivity. In their lives we see the intersection of privilege and vulnerability, intellect and silence, ambition and restraint. They lived in the shadow of a queen whose brief reign altered England's destiny, yet even that connection could not secure them a place in the story she helped to write. To recover their memory is to widen the lens of history, to acknowledge that the Tudor age was not only the tale of monarchs and ministers, but also of women who read, thought, and wrote, even when the world refused to hear them. Jane Seymour's legacy, often reduced to the birth of a son and a tragic death, extends far beyond that narrow image. It includes the sisters and nieces whose lives unfolded in the long shadow she left behind, women whose disappearance from history speaks not of insignificance, but of the enduring power of silence. Their vanishing act, though it deprived them of fame, gives modern readers a rare chance to confront the limits of recorded memory. The Seymours remind us that what is lost is not necessarily unimportant, and that behind every great name of the Tudor court stands a lineage of forgotten lives. Their erasure was not complete. The faint traces that remain, a poem, a letter, a name in a chronicle, are enough to break the silence. They may have been written out of their own time, but in rediscovering them, we restore a missing part of the Tudor world, one that speaks as eloquently through absence as through presence. In the years following the turbulence that surrounded Elizabeth and Catherine Seymour, The surviving members of their family continued to move in the shifting currents of Tudor politics. Their lives, though quieter than those of the great monarchs and statesmen of their time, were bound to the transformations that redefined England. They lived in a world where favor could vanish overnight, where marriages were instruments of policy, and where silence often ensured survival. The Seymour name still carried the echo of power, but it was also shadowed by the memory of disgrace and ambition. Each generation bore the weight of both legacy and caution, a reminder of how intimately the personal and political were intertwined in the age of the Tudors. Elizabeth Seymour, whose marriage to Gregory Cromwell once bound her to one of the most formidable political families in England, had lived through both the height and the fall of Thomas Cromwell's influence. When she became Gregory's wife, she joined a household that stood at the center of Henry's reforming court. Thomas Cromwell, her father-in-law, was the king's chief minister, the architect of the break from Rome, and the most powerful man in the realm after the monarch himself. Through that connection, Elizabeth stood close to the pulse of power. Her union with Gregory was more than a family arrangement. It was a symbol of alliance between two rising houses, the Cromwells and the Seymours, both newly elevated by royal favor. For a time, this alliance seemed unassailable. Elizabeth's position, however, became perilous when fortune turned against her father-in-law. In the summer of 1540, Thomas Cromwell was arrested, condemned, and executed on charges of treason and heresy. His fall was swift and brutal, and with it came the destruction of many who depended on his protection. Elizabeth's marriage placed her in an uneasy position. As a Seymour by birth and a Cromwell by alliance, she embodied both the power and the peril of the shifting Tudor order. Yet she managed, through tact and restraint, to survive the downfall that consumed so many others. Her husband, Gregory, retained his title and estates, though the family never regained the influence they once enjoyed. Elizabeth's quiet endurance reveals much about the strategies available to women of her class. While men contended in Parliament or on the battlefield, women practiced a subtler form of politics, one rooted in household management, correspondence, and the careful navigation of favor. Elizabeth used her connections to maintain stability for her family. She understood that survival in such a volatile age required discretion. She witnessed at close range the dangers of ambition, having seen both her brother Edward's execution and her father-in-law's ruin. Out of that experience, she learned the art of endurance. Though little of her correspondence survives, the few glimpses that remain suggest a woman of intelligence, composure, and loyalty. Catherine Seymour, another of the sisters, found herself similarly bound to the fortunes of the Tudor court through marriage. She wed Henry Berkeley, heir to one of the oldest baronies in the kingdom, and through this alliance connected the new nobility of the Seymours with the ancient aristocracy of the Berkeleys. Her marriage symbolized the blending of old blood with new ambition, a union that reflected the changing fabric of Tudor society. Catherine's life was shaped by the same precarious balance that defined her siblings' experiences. She lived through an era of reform and reaction, where loyalties shifted as monarchs changed and religious alignments altered. The households of Elizabeth and Catherine were not merely domestic spaces, but centers of political communication. In the Tudor world, letters were instruments of diplomacy, and hospitality was an expression of allegiance. Noble women managed these spheres with skill, ensuring that their families remained visible without becoming vulnerable. Catherine's marriage brought her into circles that demanded careful neutrality. Her husband's family, while loyal to the crown, often navigated the dangerous boundary between favor and disfavor. The Berkeleys' wealth and heritage secured them a place at court, but they avoided the excesses of ambition that had doomed others. Catherine's own temperament, from what can be inferred, was one of prudence. She had seen too closely what happened to those who reached too high. As the decades passed, the Seymour family's fortunes ebbed and flowed with the political tides. The execution of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, during the reign of Edward VI, and the earlier downfall of Thomas Seymour left indelible marks on their reputation. Under Queen Mary, the family sought to regain standing through quiet service rather than bold ambition. Elizabeth and Catherine, though less visible than their male relatives, played essential roles in maintaining the family's cohesion. In letters and alliances, they upheld the Seymour name while avoiding the spotlight that had proved fatal to so many of their kin. The story of the Seymour sisters and their descendants is not merely one of survival, but of adaptation. In a court defined by spectacle and treachery, they mastered the virtues of discretion, patience, and intellect. The men of their family had risen through audacity. The women endured through restraint. This contrast between male ambition and female endurance runs throughout Tudor history. Where the brothers sought crowns and titles, the sisters preserved lineages and legacies. Their work, though rarely acknowledged by chroniclers, was the quiet labor that ensured the family's survival through the storms of politics. Elizabeth Seymour's life offers an especially clear example of this dynamic. After her husband's death, she managed her estates and secured her children's futures. Her position as a widow afforded her a degree of independence rare for women of her time. She became the matriarch of a line that would later blend into the broader English nobility, her descendants inheriting both her Seymour blood and her Cromwell connection. Though she never returned to the heart of royal politics, her prudence ensured that her children did not share the tragic fates of their more ambitious uncles. Her life's quiet dignity contrasts sharply with the violence and ambition that had once surrounded her family. Catherine's later years followed a similar path of stability. The Berkeleys, cautious and conservative, maintained their estates through the reigns of Mary and Elizabeth. As religious tempests swept the nation, Catherine's household reflected a pragmatic tolerance, emphasizing loyalty to the crown above all else. She lived long enough to see the consolidation of Elizabeth's power and the gradual fading of the violent factionalism that had torn the earlier Tudor court apart. Though history records her name only in genealogies and marriage registers, her contribution to her family's endurance was no less real. The lives of these women illuminate the hidden structures that supported the Tudor world. Behind every policy and rebellion were networks of families held together by women who managed households, forged alliances, and preserved reputations. Elizabeth and Catherine belonged to a generation that understood both the possibilities and the perils of proximity to power. Their marriages linked them to the most influential men of their time, but their survival depended on restraint. They learned, as their brothers often did not, that discretion could be a greater safeguard than ambition. The pattern of the Seymours' rise and fall mirrors the broader rhythm of Tudor politics. Each ascent was followed by a collapse, each triumph shadowed by loss. Jane Seymour's brief queenship had elevated her family to unparalleled heights, but her death left them exposed. Edward's regency brought momentary dominance, followed by disgrace. Thomas's reckless intrigue destroyed him. Even as later Seymours regained some influence under Elizabeth, the memory of those earlier disasters lingered. The family's women absorbed those lessons most deeply, channeling their ambitions into cultural and domestic spheres rather than the treacherous world of court politics. That shift from visibility to silence can be seen not as erasure, but as strategy. To withdraw from the center of power was, for many women of their rank, a means of protection. Elizabeth's careful management of her estates and Catherine's measured conduct within her marriage reveal a deliberate embrace of stability over spectacle. Their choices contrast with the more flamboyant conduct of contemporaries who sought attention and paid dearly for it. In their restraint lies a form of quiet strength, one that later historians often overlook because it leaves fewer traces in the record. Yet even silence tells a story. The absence of scandal in their lives, the lack of dramatic downfall, speaks to the discipline and intelligence with which they navigated their circumstances. They lived through some of the most turbulent decades in English history. The dissolution of the monasteries, the religious reforms of Henry and Edward, the Marian Restoration, and the Elizabethan settlement. In each of these transformations, families were destroyed or remade. That the Seymours endured, however modestly, owes much to the composure of women like Elizabeth and Catherine. Their legacy can also be traced in the subtle ways their kin continued to shape English society. The descendants of Elizabeth Seymour and Gregory Cromwell carried both the reforming zeal of the Cromwells and the royal blood of the Seymours. Over generations, those lines blended into the broader fabric of the English aristocracy, their origins in the upheavals of the 16th century gradually softened by time. Catherine's descendants through the Berkeleys likewise maintained their influence, participating in local governance and serving the crown without seeking dangerous prominence. In this way, the quiet prudence of the sisters became a foundation for their family's long-term survival. The broader pattern of their lives also reflects the changing role of women in the Tudor and early Stuart world. The intellectual ideals of the Renaissance had begun to open new possibilities for female education, yet social expectations remained restrictive. The Seymour sisters and their nieces belonged to that transitional generation that could study and write but not easily publish or govern. They lived at the threshold of a cultural shift that would only later allow women's voices to emerge more freely. Their restraint was both a necessity and a sign of the times. Looking back, it is striking how their stories reveal the invisible threads that connect domestic life to the grand narratives of politics and religion. The Reformation, the succession crises, the rise and fall of ministers. All were felt not only in council chambers, but in the private halls of noble households where women like Elizabeth and Catherine managed the consequences. They negotiated marriages that aligned families, brokered reconciliations after feuds, and ensured that children inherited secure legacies. Their actions rarely appear in chronicles, yet without them the noble order of Tudor England could not have sustained itself. In the years after Queen Elizabeth's death, the Seymours' story became part of the larger tapestry of English nobility. The family no longer stood at the heart of government, but its branches extended across the realm, rooted in estates managed by the descendants of women who had weathered the storms of their century. The lessons learned by Elizabeth and Catherine, caution, adaptability, and endurance, became the quiet inheritance of their lineage. They had seen how swiftly power could consume those who courted it too boldly. Their choice to live within its margins ensured that their families would outlast the dynastic tempests that destroyed so many others. The story of Elizabeth and Catherine Seymour is not one of grand triumphs or tragic ends, but of resilience. They inhabited a world that rewarded boldness in men and punished it in women, a world where silence could be both safety and strength. Their lives were shaped by the same storms that swept through the courts of their brothers and cousins, yet they found a way to endure when others fell. Through them, the Seymour name survived its own ruin, carried forward not by power or titles but by persistence. Their legacy reminds us that the history of the Tudors is not only the story of kings, queens, and ministers, but also of those who lived in their shadows. The women who sustained families, preserved estates, and held together the fragile threads of continuity amid chaos. Elizabeth and Catherine, though rarely mentioned in the Grand Chronicles, stand as representatives of that quieter strength. Their endurance gave meaning to the fleeting triumphs and tragedies of their age. In their discretion lay the wisdom that the turbulent world around them so often lacked. And through their calm in the face of shifting fortunes, they left behind a legacy that, though understated, endures far longer than the brief blaze of ambition that once consumed the men of their house. The rise of Edward and Thomas Seymour was as dazzling as their fall was brutal. Their story, shaped by ambition and marked by miscalculation, cast a long shadow over their family. From the moment their sister Jane became queen, their fortunes were bound to hers. Her marriage to King Henry had elevated them from minor gentry to the highest ranks of nobility, and her death left them with both privilege and peril. Without Jane's gentle influence at court, the brothers were left to navigate the dangerous politics of a king who trusted few and punished swiftly. Their ascent was not only a family triumph, but also the beginning of a chain of events that would test the resilience of every Seymour who bore their name. Edward Seymour, the elder brother, was the more cautious of the two. He was a soldier, a statesman, and a man of methodical ambition. Under Henry, he earned distinction on the battlefield and favor in council, proving himself both capable and loyal. When Henry's only legitimate son, Prince Edward, was born through Jane Seymour, the child's uncles became central to the line of succession. The birth of the prince transformed Edward's future. As uncle to the heir, he stood within reach of power itself. His title of Earl of Hertford and later Duke of Somerset reflected the king's confidence, but that confidence was rooted less in affection than in utility. Henry valued him as a servant of his dynasty, not as a friend. Thomas Seymour, by contrast, was restless and impulsive. Handsome, charming, and reckless, he possessed the magnetism that his elder brother lacked. Where Edward calculated, Thomas acted. Where Edward sought order, Thomas craved excitement. His ambitions were no less grand, though less disciplined. Even while his brother advanced through the king's favor, Thomas felt overshadowed. He served in diplomacy and at sea, but his achievements could not match Edward's political success. Yet it was his boldness that caught the eye of many at court. He moved easily among courtiers, cultivated friendships with the king's companions, and understood the value of charm in a world ruled by suspicion. When Henry died in the January of 1547, leaving his 9-year-old son to inherit the throne, the balance of power within the Seymour family shifted dramatically. Edward was named one of the executors of the late king's will and quickly emerged as the most dominant figure among them. Within months he was appointed Lord Protector, ruling England in the name of the young King Edward VI. For a brief time, the Seymour family held more influence than any other in the realm. Edward's word was law, his authority almost regal. Yet even in triumph, the seeds of his downfall were being sown. As protector, Edward sought to advance both the Protestant Reformation and his own vision of social order. His government promoted the translation of the scriptures, the abolition of Catholic rituals, and the reform of church wealth. To many reformers, he was a hero of progress. To traditionalists, he was a dangerous radical. His policies aimed at relieving the poor and curbing the abuses of landlords alienated the very nobility whose support he needed. His brother Thomas, denied a significant role in the government, grew resentful. The brothers' relationship, once united by ambition, became poisoned by rivalry. Thomas believed he deserved a share of power equal to his brothers. His charm and daring, however, could not match Edward's cautious statecraft. Seeking to secure his own influence, Thomas began to act independently. In a move that shocked the court, he secretly married Catherine Parr, the Dowager Queen, within months of Henry's death. The marriage, while lawful, was politically unwise. Catherine was the stepmother of the young king and the guardian of Princess Elizabeth. By marrying her, Thomas not only breached protocol, but also placed himself in proximity to both the king and the princess in a way that invited suspicion. The union between Thomas and Catherine was passionate but brief. Catherine, intelligent and experienced, had hoped for domestic peace after the turbulence of her previous marriages. Yet Thomas's ambitions soon disrupted that hope. He sought to influence the young king directly, visiting him in his chambers and trying to secure his affection with gifts and promises. When these efforts failed, Thomas's behavior became erratic. He resented his brother's authority, undermined his policies, and hinted at reforms that would favor his own advancement. Edward, faced with the growing threat of his brother's scheming, struggled between family loyalty and the necessity of state control. The tension between them reached its peak after Catherine Parr's death in childbirth in the late summer of 1548. Freed from the moderating influence of his wife, Thomas grew reckless. He courted Princess Elizabeth with flirtations that scandalized those around her, hoping perhaps to marry her and thus claim the throne through royal blood. Whether his intentions were truly treasonous or simply foolish remains uncertain, but in the eyes of Edward's government, his conduct was intolerable. In early 1549, Thomas was arrested on charges of treason, accused of plotting to kidnap the king and usurp authority. His trial revealed both his audacity and his isolation. Few defended him. Even Edward, though tormented by guilt, signed the warrant for his brother's execution. In March of that year, Thomas Seymour was beheaded on Tower Hill, his life ended by the same system of power he had sought to control. His death marked the first great fracture in the Seymour family's ascent. For Edward, it was both a political necessity and a personal tragedy. For the Seymour sisters, it was a catastrophe that cast a shadow over their lives. The consequences of Thomas's downfall rippled through every branch of the family. The sisters, once associated with the prestige of royal kinship, now carried the burden of scandal. Their marriages, estates, and reputations came under scrutiny. Elizabeth Seymour, wife of Gregory Cromwell, had already learned the cost of political misfortune when her father-in-law fell from grace. Now she witnessed another collapse, closer and more personal. Catherine Seymour, too, felt the impact. The disgrace of one brother tainted them all. At a time when reputation was a form of currency, the association with treason could ruin even the most cautious household. Yet the storm was not over. Edward's position as protector began to crumble soon after his brother's execution. The same nobles who had envied his authority now accused him of arrogance and mismanagement. His reforms, though well-intentioned, created unrest among both the wealthy and the poor. Uprisings in the countryside, sparked by economic hardship and religious change, eroded his support. His enemies within the council, led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, plotted his removal. In the autumn of 1549, Edward was arrested, briefly released, and then reappointed with diminished power. His authority never recovered. By 1551, his opponents had gathered enough strength to destroy him completely. Accused of conspiracy against the council and of endangering the stability of the realm, he was imprisoned in the Tower, tried, and executed early the following year. His death ended the political dominance of the Seymour family. In less than 5 years, both brothers who had ruled England through their sister's legacy had been cut down by the same relentless machinery of royal politics that had first elevated them. For the sisters, their brother's downfall was not only a public disgrace, but also a private reckoning. Their survival depended on retreat and silence. They learned that in Tudor England, a woman's safety was often measured by her ability to disappear from political sight. They withdrew into their households, managed their estates, and avoided any appearance of dissent or ambition. The experience of seeing both their brothers executed by the crown stripped them of any remaining illusions about power. They understood that proximity to the throne was as dangerous as it was rewarding. In the years that followed, the Seymour name became a cautionary emblem of overreaching ambition. The memory of Jane, once revered as the king's beloved queen and mother of his heir, was overshadowed by the bloodshed that her brother's ambitions had unleashed. Even those who bore no blame, such as the sisters and the younger generation, carried the stigma of association. Their letters and marriages were carefully monitored, their alliances chosen with care. The family's estates were restored in part, but their influence at court never returned to its former height. The human cost of the brothers' downfall extended beyond their family. Servants, allies, and dependents who had tied their fortunes to the Seymours faced ruin. Some lost lands, others positions, and a few their lives. The executions of Thomas and Edward were accompanied by waves of confiscations and inquiries. The Tudor court, ever wary of lingering loyalty to fallen men, purged those connected to them. The Seymours' allies learned that friendship could be fatal when politics turned. And yet, within this ruin, a quieter story endured, one of resilience and adaptation. The surviving Seymours, especially the women, rebuilt their lives in the margins of history. They managed their households with quiet diligence, restoring what they could of the family's dignity. Elizabeth Seymour, with her experience of both rise and fall, embodied this new realism. She knew that to endure in such a world required neither power nor glory, but patience. Catherine and the others followed a similar path, emphasizing stability over ambition. Their restraint stands in stark contrast to their brother's restless pursuit of greatness. Edward's vision of a reformed England and Thomas's dreams of personal glory both ended in ruin, yet their sister's cautious endurance allowed the family line to survive. In that sense, the true legacy of the Seymours was not forged in the council chambers or on the scaffold, but in the quiet perseverance of the women who endured after the storm. The downfall of the brothers also revealed the broader pattern of Tudor power, a world where loyalty was conditional and success was always provisional. Edward and Thomas had risen not because of their own birthright, but because of their sister's brief ascendancy. Their authority depended on royal favor, and once that favor cooled, they were doomed. The same system that exalted them ensured their destruction. Their deaths were not simply punishments for personal failings. They were demonstrations of a monarchy determined to remind its servants that no subject, however exalted, was beyond control. For the Seymour sisters, this truth became a guiding principle. They learned to measure their actions within the narrow limits allowed to them. They witnessed how quickly the court could turn admiration into suspicion. Their correspondence and alliances reflect a deliberate withdrawal from the kind of ambition that had destroyed their brothers. In their silence, they found a form of survival that history often overlooks, but that sustained them through the shifting reigns of Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. In the broader narrative of Tudor England, the Seymours' story illustrates the cost of power in a world governed by volatility. The same family that had given England its male heir became an example of how perilous royal favor could be. Jane's gentle image as the mother of the future king could not protect her brothers from the ruthless logic of politics, nor could it shield her sisters from the consequences of their ambition. The family's rise and fall compressed within a single generation the entire cycle of Tudor fortune: elevation, dominance, suspicion, and destruction. By the end of the century, the Seymours' power had transformed from political authority into historical memory. The sisters who had lived through the brothers' downfall became quiet custodians of a name once glorious, now shadowed by tragedy. They preserved what remained of their family's estates, raised their children to caution, and passed on the lessons learned in blood. Their story, though often left untold, completes the arc of the Seymour saga. The tale of a family that touched the summit of power only to find it crumbling beneath them. In that sense, the legacy of Edward and Thomas Seymour extends beyond their own fates. Their ambition reshaped the lives of their sisters, nieces, and descendants. It demonstrated that in the Tudor world, every rise carried within it the seed of its fall, and every act of power demanded a reckoning. Their sisters understood this truth better than anyone. They lived in its aftermath, their quiet lives a counterpoint to their brothers' loud ambitions. Through them, the Seymour name endured, chastened, diminished, but not destroyed. What remains of the Seymours' story is a meditation on the nature of power and the fragility of those who seek it. Edward's vision of righteous governance and Thomas's hunger for personal glory both collapsed under the weight of human weakness and political reality. Yet the sisters' endurance offers a quieter kind of triumph, one not written in chronicles, but preserved in the persistence of lineage. Theirs was the wisdom of survival in a world where ambition could kill and discretion could save. Through their endurance, the Seymours lived on, long after the noise of power had faded into history. The story of the Seymour family, once entangled in ambition, downfall, and silence, would have faded entirely if not for the fragments left behind in letters, records, and the faint traces of memory that resisted oblivion. To reclaim their stories is to assemble a mosaic from scattered shards, each piece offering a glimpse into a forgotten life. It is a task that demands patience and imagination, for the world that once recorded every triumph of kings and every failure of ministers rarely bothered to preserve the voices of women whose contributions were quiet but vital. Yet in those faint traces lies the heartbeat of a history that cannot be told in terms of crowns and wars alone. The women of the Seymour family lived in the spaces between power and silence. Their brothers, Edward and Thomas, had dominated their world through ambition, and their ruin had nearly erased the family name from honor. But the sisters and daughters who lived after them carried forward something more enduring than titles, a pattern of survival. They did not challenge the order of their world openly, yet they shaped it through resilience, intellect, and the steady maintenance of dignity when everything around them collapsed. Reconstructing their lives from the scraps left behind restores a lost balance to the narrative of their time. The first fragments of their stories lie in household accounts and private letters, the everyday documents that outlived their authors. In these we see how the Seymour women managed estates, corresponded with relatives, and cared for dependents. These mundane records reveal the rhythm of their days: the purchase of linen for servants, the management of tenants, the education of children. Through such details, their voices emerge not as footnotes to the ambitions of men, but as central figures in the preservation of their family's legacy. In an age when women's words were seldom recorded unless they caused scandal, such evidence offers a rare window into their agency. Elizabeth Seymour's letters to her husband's associates show her as a woman of discretion and wit, cautious in expression yet confident in judgment. She wrote about matters of property, inheritance, and obligation with a clarity that reflects both intelligence and experience. Her life after the fall of her brothers was marked not by retreat into obscurity, but by careful stewardship. She understood that the stability of her household depended on prudence, not daring. Each letter, each small decision, was part of a quiet campaign to preserve what could be saved from the wreckage of ambition. Catherine Seymour's traces are fewer, but no less significant. In marriage and widowhood, she moved within circles that linked the new nobility of the Tudor court with the old aristocracy of England. Her position required the diplomacy of a survivor. She was neither a reformer nor a rebel, but her endurance itself was a form of resistance against the volatility that destroyed so many families. Through marriages, inheritances, and alliances, she helped to weave her family back into the broader fabric of English life, ensuring that the Seymour name did not vanish entirely into disgrace. The younger generation, including the daughters and nieces who grew up in the aftermath of the brothers' downfall, inherited a legacy of caution shaped by tragedy. They were taught to value learning, faith, and restraint. The intellectual culture fostered by their aunt and Stanhope and their cousins created a haven of study within a world still dominated by suspicion. These women read scripture, studied languages, and exchanged letters on moral and philosophical subjects. Their education, though confined within social limits, was part of a broader current that saw noble women asserting themselves as thinkers and readers. When the Seymour sisters and their descendants engaged with the new learning of the Renaissance, they joined a quiet revolution that redefined what it meant to be a woman in Tudor England. The same world that punished female ambition in politics began, however tentatively, to admire it in intellect. The humanist tradition that had inspired Catherine Parr and other learned women of the court found a home in the households of the Seymours. Though they did not seek fame, their interest in classical studies and theology aligned them with a generation of women who expanded the boundaries of acceptable female expression. Their writings, particularly the Latin elegies of Anne, Margaret, and Jane Seymour, stand as remarkable examples of this intellectual flowering. The poems mourn the death of Margaret of Navarre, a queen celebrated for her wit and piety. Yet in lamenting her, the Seymour sisters also reflected upon their own condition. Their verses reveal not only linguistic mastery, but also philosophical depth, expressing both reverence and a subtle awareness of their own precarious place in history. In an era when women were expected to write only devotional verse, their engagement with classical themes of virtue and transience placed them within the broader European tradition of learned women. For centuries, those verses were forgotten, surviving only in obscure collections. Their rediscovery in modern scholarship transformed our understanding of women's participation in Renaissance literature. The Seymours were not isolated anomalies, but part of a network of educated women who corresponded, read, and wrote across England and beyond. Their work challenges the notion that Tudor women were mere adornments to power. Instead, it shows them as active participants in the intellectual life of their age. The process of piecing together their stories from such scattered traces also sheds light on how history itself chooses what to remember. For every letter preserved, countless others were lost. For every name recorded in a ledger, many more vanished unnoted. The Seymours' survival in the historical record owes much to accident. A document kept in a family archive, a mention in a chronicler's account, a legal petition that required their signatures. Each fragment, however small, contributes to a mosaic that reveals the endurance of women who refused to let circumstance define their worth. Their lives also illuminate the wider experience of Tudor women navigating the shifting boundaries of religion, power, and family. The Reformation, which divided England for generations, transformed not only the church but also the roles of women within it. The emphasis on scripture reading and personal faith encouraged female literacy, while the dissolution of convents removed one of the few established paths for women's independence. Noble women like the Seymours adapted to this new world by turning their households into centers of devotion and education. Within their estates, they fostered piety, charity, and the moral order that underpinned the new Protestant identity. In this way, the Seymours' survival was tied not only to prudence, but also to spiritual discipline. The tragedies that had destroyed their brothers taught them the futility of worldly ambition. Faith offered a more enduring foundation. Their letters and wills often express a deep concern for conscience and duty, reflecting the Protestant ideal of the godly household. Their faith was not radical, but it was sincere, a form of quiet conviction that sustained them through loss. In their piety, we see the transformation of ambition into moral purpose. The recovery of their voices also challenges long-held assumptions about how history values its subjects. For generations, chroniclers measured significance by proximity to power. Kings, ministers, and soldiers filled the pages of official narratives, while the women who preserved families and guided generations remained invisible. Only in recent scholarship has attention turned to those who operated outside the corridors of formal authority. Through this shift, the Seymours re-emerge not as mere relatives of greater men, but as figures who embodied the resilience of their age. To reconstruct their legacy is to recognize that endurance itself is a form of influence. The Seymours' story illustrates that the preservation of culture, faith, and memory depends as much on those who endure as on those who lead. Their letters kept families connected across distance. Their education ensured that their children inherited more than estates. Their piety stabilized communities in times of turmoil. These acts, though uncelebrated, shaped the moral and social foundations of Tudor England as surely as any royal decree. The lessons drawn from their lives extend beyond their century. The Seymours' experience demonstrates how women, constrained by convention, could nonetheless exercise agency through intellect and integrity. Their survival in a world that destroyed their brothers' ambitions shows the power of adaptability. They understood that to endure was not to surrender, but to persist with purpose. Their quiet strength reveals that history's most enduring legacies often emerge not from dominance, but from perseverance. Reclaiming their stories also forces a reckoning with the way memory operates. The Tudor age, celebrated for its grandeur and drama, left behind countless unacknowledged lives. The Seymours, like many noble families, were shaped as much by loss as by achievement. Their brothers' executions, their sister's death in childbirth, their niece's disappearance. All were reminders of how fragile power could be. Yet in each tragedy, the women of the family responded not with despair, but with endurance. Their ability to continue, to maintain households and educate children, ensured that their family did not vanish as so many others had. In the centuries that followed, their descendants would reclaim portions of that lost prestige. The family name reappeared in Parliament, in military service, and in marriages that connected them to new dynasties. Yet the foundation of that recovery rested on the quiet strength of the women who bridged the gap between ruin and renewal. They transmitted the lessons of caution and faith that became the moral core of their lineage. Through them, the Seymour's story transformed from a tale of ambition's failure to one of endurance's triumph. Modern historians, revisiting the Tudor world through the lens of gender and social history, have brought these women back into focus. The discovery of their writings, the re-evaluation of their roles, and the recognition of their intellectual contributions have restored a dimension long missing from the narrative of their time. Their rediscovery is not merely an act of academic correction, but a reminder that history itself is a living process, one that must constantly question whose voices it preserves and whose it neglects. In studying the Seymours anew, we also confront broader questions about how memory is shaped. Their erasure was not accidental but cultural. The Tudor chroniclers who shaped the official story of the age celebrated conquest and power, not endurance and reflection. The rediscovery of the Seymour women challenges that bias, revealing a counter-history of patience, morality, and intellect. It reminds us that the survival of a civilization depends not only on rulers, but on those who sustain its fabric through quieter means. Their stories also speak to the continuing relevance of resilience in the face of instability. The Tudor century, with its revolutions in faith and governance, tested the adaptability of every family touched by power. The Seymours' ability to endure despite disgrace mirrors the persistence of countless women who have navigated the uncertainties of changing worlds. Their legacy is not confined to their time. It resonates across ages as a testament to the quiet forms of courage that sustain human history. Through the reclamation of their stories, we gain more than biographical detail. We recover a vision of the Tudor world enriched by depth and nuance. We see that the age was not defined solely by the wills of monarchs, but also by the endurance of those who lived under them. The Seymours' journey from obscurity to rediscovery reveals that history's silences are not immutable. What was once lost can be found again, and in that finding, the meaning of the past itself is renewed. The lessons drawn from their survival endure beyond their names. Their patience in adversity, their quiet pursuit of knowledge, and their ability to rebuild after ruin offer a form of wisdom that outlasts power. They remind us that influence does not always announce itself with grandeur. Sometimes it persists in the steadfast maintenance of life amid collapse, in the preservation of virtue when the world rewards ambition. The Seymours' legacy, once buried beneath the noise of history, now stands as a testament to that enduring truth. Their rediscovery also changes how we interpret the age that produced them. The Tudors have long been remembered as a dynasty of bold rulers and dramatic turns, yet the Seymours' story reveals another England, one of domestic faith, intellectual curiosity, and quiet perseverance. Within that world, women were not passive spectators, but active participants in the shaping of moral and cultural continuity. Through them, the foundations of later English identity were laid, rooted in learning, conscience, and endurance. To reclaim their stories is to restore balance to the historical record. It is to acknowledge that power, when stripped of its spectacle, often rests upon the labor of those who remain unseen. The Seymour women, through their intellect, faith, and composure, preserved the integrity of their family, and in doing so, contributed to the stability of their age. Their legacy invites us to listen not only to the voices that history shouts, but also to those it whispers. The final lesson of their lives lies in the understanding that endurance itself is a form of greatness. In a world that punished ambition and rewarded caution, the Seymours turned survival into a quiet art. They remind us that history's truest measure of significance is not the scale of one's triumphs, but the depth of one's persistence. Their stories, once lost, now reclaimed, illuminate the enduring truth that strength often resides not in conquest, but in the steadfast will to endure when power has passed away.